Hill Street wasn't a fancy neighborhood, but it had its charm. The kind of place where the houses were old but solid, the streets were quiet, and neighbors mostly kept to themselves. When the Martin family moved into 127 Hill Street, they thought they'd struck gold. A big old house at a bargain price? What's the catch? "It's perfect," Susan Martin said, running her fingers along the carved banister. "A little creaky, sure, but think of the history." Her husband, Tom, gave her a skeptical look. "History doesn't pay for repairs," he muttered, glancing at the cracked ceiling. Their daughter, Emma, twirled around in the spacious living room, her laughter echoing off the high ceilings. "I love it. It feels like a castle." For a while, it did feel like a dream. The house had quirks, sure, but nothing a bit of elbow grease couldn't fix. Until the first night. It started with footsteps. Tom was the first to hear them. He'd woken up around 2 a.m., thirsty. As he made his way down the dark hallway toward the kitchen, he froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Soft, deliberate steps coming from upstairs. But everyone was in bed, weren't they? "Susan?" he called out, his voice low. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Tom stood there for a long moment, his heart hammering. Finally, he shook his head and went back to bed. Probably just the house settling, he told himself. Old houses made noise. But by the third night, even Susan couldn't dismiss it. "Tom," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Tom sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps were louder now, pacing back and forth above their bedroom. He reached for the baseball bat he kept by the bed and crept up steps, Susan following close behind. The hallway was empty. So were the rooms. Yet the footsteps continued, moving just out of reach, as if the house itself was alive. By the end of the first week, none of them were sleeping well. The footsteps were constant now, day and night. And it wasn't just footsteps. Doors creaked open on their own. Lights flickered. Shadows moved where there shouldn't be any. Emma, usually fearless, clung to her parents. "There's a lady in my room," she whispered one morning at breakfast. Susan's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Emma's eyes were wide and solemn. "She stands by the window. She's crying. I think she's sad." Tom's grip tightened on his coffee mug. "It's just your imagination," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Susan decided to do some digging. She visited the local library, poring over old newspapers and records. It didn't take long to find the story. In 1928, the house belonged to the Caldwell family. They were a well-to-do couple with a young son. But one stormy night, something terrible happened. The details were murky. Some said it was a burglary gone wrong. Others whispered about Mr. Caldwell's temper. What everyone agreed on was this. By morning, the entire family was dead, and the house had never been the same. "The restless spirits," the librarian said, lowering her voice. "They say they'll never leave. They can't." The activity escalated after Susan's discovery. The footsteps turned into banging. Furniture moved on its own. Emma started talking to someone who wasn't there. "Tommy says the lady wants us to go," she said one evening, her voice eerily calm. "Who's Tommy?" Susan asked, her throat dry. "The little boy," Emma replied. "He lives here too." Tom decided enough was enough. "We're leaving," he said, packing their bags. But the house had other plans. The front door wouldn't open. Neither would the windows. The house groaned and creaked, as if alive, trapping them inside. Desperate, Susan turned to the journal she'd found in the library archives. It had belonged to Mrs. Caldwell, and the final entry was chilling. "They won't rest. They never sleep. And now, neither do we." That night, Susan lit candles in the living room and demanded answers. "What do you want?" she screamed into the shadows. The temperature dropped, and the candles flickered. A voice whispered, soft and sorrowful, "Leave, but we can't." Suddenly, the room filled with a cacophony of voices, all shouting, crying, begging. Susan clutched her ears, falling to her knees. Emma screamed as the shadows in the corners began to move, coalescing into human shapes. It was Tom who figured it out. As the house seemed to close in around them, he remembered something he'd read in one of the old articles. The Caldwells had been buried in the backyard. "We have to dig," he said, grabbing a shovel. In the pouring rain, they unearthed the graves. The remains were still there, hidden under decades of soil. As Tom and Susan uncovered the bones, the house groaned loudly, almost like a scream, and then silence. The front door creaked open on its own. The Martins didn't stay to see if the spirits were truly gone. They packed their things and left Hill Street that very night. The house stood empty once more, its windows dark and lifeless. But sometimes late at night, the neighbors swear they hear footsteps, pacing, restless, in the house that never sleeps. The house on Hill Street had been empty for decades. Nobody in the small town of Woodhaven liked to talk about it much, and those who did spoke in hushed tones, as if the place might hear them. But to Claire and her son Danny, the old Victorian was nothing more than a fixer-upper. A fresh start after her divorce. A bargain, really. The house loomed over the end of the street, its windows like black, lifeless eyes staring out at the world. The paint had peeled away in strips, exposing gray wood beneath, and the porch sagged like a tired old man. But Claire saw potential. "It's not so bad," she said as she unlocked the front door. Danny, barely 12 and glued to his handheld game, didn't look up. "Yeah, sure, Mom." The door creaked open, and a wave of stale air hit them. It smelled of mildew and something else, something faintly sour, like spoiled milk. Claire wrinkled her nose and flipped the light switch. Nothing. The electricity wasn't on yet. "We'll get some lamps," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "It's gonna be great, Danny. You'll see." But as they stepped inside, the floorboards groaned beneath their feet, and the shadows seemed to deepen, like the house was swallowing the light from the open doorway. It started small. The first night, Claire heard faint tapping coming from the walls. Probably mice, she thought. The place was old, it was bound to have some critters, but when she set traps, they remained empty. Danny's complaints began the second night. "Mom, there's whispering in my room." Claire paused mid-sip of her coffee. "Whispering?" "Yeah, like..." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. Danny, come play with us." She forced a laugh. "You've been playing that creepy game too much. It's messing with your head." Danny frowned, but didn't argue. That night, Claire tucked him in and sat on his bed for a while, rubbing his back until he drifted off. At around midnight, she woke to the sound of footsteps overhead. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Danny was in the room next to hers. Nobody else should have been up there. Clutching a flashlight, she crept up the narrow staircase to the attic. Each step felt like it might splinter beneath her. The attic door was ajar, swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. She pushed it open and shone the flashlight inside. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on cobweb-covered trunks and broken furniture. Nothing moved. The footsteps stopped. On the fourth day, Claire found the journal. It was tucked inside a wall cavity she uncovered while stripping wallpaper in the dining room. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages smelled faintly of smoke. The entries were written in a shaky hand. March 3rd, 1923. The voices started again. "They want me to let them out. I won't. I can't." March 15th, 1923. "The shadows move at night. I see them in the corners of my room. They hate the light." March 20th, 1923. "If anyone finds this, leave. The house belongs to them now." Claire's heart pounded as she read the final entry. She slammed the journal shut and stared at the wall where she'd found it. Who had written this? And what had they meant by "let them out"? Danny grew quieter as the days passed. He stopped playing his games, stopped asking for dinner, stopped responding to Claire unless she said his name twice. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked one morning. He shrugged. "I've been playing with Tommy." Claire froze. "Tommy? Who's Tommy?" Danny smiled faintly. "He's the boy in the walls. He says we'll be friends forever." That night, Claire heard the whispers herself. They were soft at first, like wind rustling leaves, but soon grew louder, more insistent. "Let us out. Let us out." She grabbed a flashlight and stormed into the living room, heart hammering. "Who's there?" she shouted. The whispers stopped, and then the floor beneath her creaked. Slowly she looked down. A dark stain was spreading across the woods, seeping up from below. It smelled like rot and death. Claire backed away, but the stain followed, growing larger, darker. The house groaned, and the walls seemed to close in. She turned to run, but Danny stood in the doorway, his eyes wide and unblinking. "They're mad at you, Mom," he said softly. "You shouldn't have opened the wall." The next few minutes were a blur. Claire grabbed Danny and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into screams, filling the house with a deafening roar. The lights flickered on and off, casting twisted shadows on the walls. Finally, with a desperate shove, Claire broke the door open. She and Danny tumbled onto the porch, gasping for air. The house fell silent behind them. They never went back to Hill Street. Claire sold the property to a developer for a fraction of its value. She didn't care, she just wanted to forget. But sometimes late at night, she still hears the whispers, faint and distant, calling her name. The Hendersons weren't the kind of family that believed in ghosts. They were practical people, grounded in reality. When they found the house on Hill Street, a sprawling Victorian with gables like sharp teeth and windows that gleamed like watchful eyes, it seemed like the perfect place to start over. "It's a fresh start," Sarah Henderson told her husband Mike as they unloaded boxes. "The kids will love it." Mike wasn't so sure. The house was old, the kind of old that smelled like mothballs and rot. But it was cheap, and after the financial hit they'd taken, cheap was good. Their son, Jake, a lanky teenager with perpetually messy hair, wasn't impressed. "This place is creepy," he muttered, kicking a loose board on the porch. His younger sister Lily tugged at his arm. "I think it's pretty," she said, staring up at the towering house with wide eyes. "Like something out of a storybook." Jake snorted. "A horror story, maybe." The first few days were uneventful. The family settled into their new routines, unpacking boxes and scrubbing years of grime from every surface. Sarah was in her element, decorating and making the house feel like home. Mike busied himself fixing creaky floorboards and leaky faucets. But Jake felt it first, the unease. He'd hear whispers late at night, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. When he'd check, his room was empty. Just the old house settling, he told himself. Still, he started sleeping with his headphones on. Lily began talking to someone too. "Tommy says this house is his," she announced at dinner one evening. Sarah paused mid-bite. "Who's Tommy, sweetie?" Lily shrugged. "He's my friend. He lives here." Jake rolled his eyes. "Great imaginary friends. Just what we need." But Sarah's face clouded over. She forced a smile and changed the subject, but that night, she found herself double-checking the locks. Mike discovered the house's dark past by accident. While repairing a broken step in the basement, he found a stack of old newspapers stuffed into the crawl space. The headlines were chilling. "Family murdered in Hill Street house. Police baffled by gruesome scene. No survivors found." Mike felt the blood drain from his face. The articles were from 1974, detailing the brutal deaths of the Miller family. The parents and 2 children had been found dead in their beds, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The cause of death had never been determined. The house had been abandoned ever since. When he showed Sarah the articles, her hands shook. "Why didn't they tell us?" she whispered. Mike sighed. "Because no one else wanted it. And now it's ours." The whispers grew louder. Lily's imaginary friend, Tommy, became more real. "He doesn't like you," she told Sarah one morning. "He says you're not supposed to be here." Sarah knelt down, gripping her daughter's shoulders. "Sweetheart, there's no Tommy. It's just you and us in this house." Lily's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That's what he said you'd say." That night, Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps. She shook Mike awake, but he only grumbled and turned over. Grabbing a flashlight, she ventured into the hallway. The air was cold, her breath visible in the beam of light. The footsteps led her to Lily's room. Lily was standing by the window, staring out into the dark yard. "Tommy says you should leave," she said without turning around. By the second week, the house was in chaos. Jake's room was trashed every night while he slept. Lily's behavior grew stranger, her voice adopting an eerie monotone whenever she spoke about Tommy. Sarah found scratches on the walls, words carved into the wood. "Get out. Leave." Mike tried to rationalize it. "Maybe it's just kids messing with us. This house is old, Sarah. It's playing tricks on us." But deep down, he didn't believe it. None of them did. The breaking point came when they found Lily in the basement, standing in the dark with a knife in her hand. "He says you have to go," she said, her voice flat, "or he'll make you." The Hendersons decided to leave that very night. But the house had other plans. The doors wouldn't open, the windows wouldn't budge, the air grew thick, suffocating. Shadows moved in the corners, growing taller, darker, reaching out for them. "Run!" Mike shouted, grabbing Lily and dragging her up the stairs. Sarah and Jake followed, but the house was alive now, groaning and shaking, the walls closing in. They made it to the attic, barricading the door with old furniture. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices screaming, crying, laughing. "We have to end this," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We have to find him." Mike stared at her. "Find who?" "Tommy," she whispered. In the attic, they found a small, dusty door hidden behind a pile of boxes. It led to a crawl space, cramped and suffocating. Inside, they found the remains of a child, a skeleton curled up in the corner, clutching a broken toy. Lily's voice was small, trembling. "That's him." Sarah knelt down, tears streaming down her face. "We're sorry," she whispered. "We didn't know." The house groaned one last time and then fell silent. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. When they tried the front door, it opened easily. They didn't look back. The Hendersons never spoke of Hill Street again. They moved far away to a modern house with no history. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would wake to the sound of footsteps in the hall, faint and distant, as if the house wasn't quite done with them yet.